everyone and welcome to CX Club. I'd like to welcome my esteemed colleague Adrian Snook from Learning Accelerators. We'd like today to talk a little bit about cultural change and how that relates to customer experience. But first of all, before we go any further, we need to do a calibration question. First of all, Adrian, in your opinion, Game of Thrones or Battlestar Galactica first series?
It's got to be Game of Thrones, I think, isn't it? I mean, for sheer majesty, bloodshed and general sex and gore, I think Game of Thrones has definitely got it for me.
I think we clearly understand where Adrian stands on this. I'm sorry, but that was the wrong answer.
I'm sorry about that, but there you go.
Never mind, I'm sorry.
The truth will out.
You failed, right. Thank you very much for joining us. No, we'll carry on. Okay, so just give us a little bit of an introduction about you and your background and everything like that, so people who don't know you know
okay.
about you.
Yeah, so my background isn't actually in the customer experience space at all. I've spent the last 25 years working in custom learning solutions, so developing solutions using a whole range of technologies to solve business issues or challenges that organisations have. So in computer-based training, in video production, in all kinds of digital solutions, 3D, AR, VR. So essentially I look at life through the prism of people and performance challenges, and then delivering solutions through whatever technology is appropriate at the time.
Okay, excellent. And you've got a background in culture, though, haven't you? From
yes, and my degree is actually in communication and culture with public media. So that's from Leeds University. So I look at a lot of what's going on in the culture change space with a mixture of concern and incredulity, I think, sometimes.
And likewise in the customer experience space, hence the whole purpose of CX Club. Okay, so just to introduce to everybody, we're also going to be talking about employee experience, but we're going to be treating that as a sort of a separate subject that kind of like bolts on to the conversation around cultural change. So the first question I have, Adrian, is, in your opinion, do you think culture can be changed?
I think I throw that back at you and say, well, why would you want to change something as ephemeral and tied up with society as a culture? Why would you want to change a culture for its own sake?
Okay. So, of course, when we're talking about cultural change, we're talking about cultural change within an organisation, I guess. But I suppose the real reason why organisations, the point that I would put forward is the real reason organisations want to change culture is because they want to improve the commercial performance of their organisations.
So really your objective isn't really changing culture at all, it's changing behaviour.
Yes, I guess so, but the two are inextricably linked, I would argue, and therefore.
Yeah, I think most people accept that as a truth, if you like, but it can be very dangerous to start thinking about, first of all, culture as something you can objectively judge.
Yeah.
Because to all intents and purposes, if you're immersed in an organisation, its culture becomes transparent. It's the way you do things around here.
Yep.
It's common sense. So if you're within a culture, it's transparent, and the logic behind everything that happens is self-evident.
Yep.
If you're from outside that culture, if you're not native to it, then it may well appear to be problematic because you've got no real rooting or understanding in how it is that culture came to evolve and why people value the things that they do. Culture is constructed through language and through a view of the world.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to actually be objective about something as intangible as a culture.
But what you can be objective about is the commercial performance of an organisation.
Yes.
And of course, if you're doing some kind of diagnostic on an organisation and you there could be a number of reasons, different reasons why that organisation is failing. And one of the generic terms, I guess, that gets used is this organisation has a cultural problem. And therefore, and I've seen this quite recently, the company that somebody who's very close to me works for has recently merged with another organisation. And the reason why is that they've had the same culture for years and years and years and years. The world around them has changed. They haven't evolved. They still have the same belief system. They still have the same mindset. But unfortunately, the commercials are going down the drain. And at that point, you have to change the behaviour of the organisation. So I guess what you're saying, that cultural change is a byproduct.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that it's very seductive to think about any organisation as having a singular monolithic culture. And for organisations of any size, in my experience, that's not really true. So first of all, if you look at a national organisation, you'll very likely find that there are a number of different subcultures possibly in that national organisation, or even distinct cultures if part of the organisation is the result of a merger or an acquisition. And particularly if the activities undertaken in those two bits of the organisation are fundamentally different. They do different things, they've employed different people, they've got different management styles. There may well be a very different cultural position in those areas. So within a national organisation, you have a range of different cultural belief systems, and they may well be changing through all kinds of influences over time anyway. And then, of course, in a multinational organisation, you've got national cultures and religious and ethnic sensibilities overlaid over those corporate cultures. So it's a very, very complicated picture. And sometimes when people are saying, well, how can I improve my culture, singular, I look at that and I think, this person doesn't really get it, do they? They don't really understand the complexity of what they're dealing with.
You've spoken about pluralities. Can I just put my false teeth in? Yeah. Pluralities of culture.
So really there is a plurality of culture involved, and so I think one of the challenges for leaders is they will often go to leadership and management, or mainly leadership courses, and then what will be very much stressed is it's their responsibility to change the culture of the organisation. Well, let's just take a step back and go, okay, well, why is the culture of the organisation as it is? It's evolved the way it has for some good reasons. Some things may have changed, some other things might not, but everybody in that belief system is currently wedded to it. So if you want to go around making a difference as a leader, and I'm sure everyone will, you have to basically start to look at that culture from a number of different perspectives to try to actually establish the picture. Is it a monolithic culture? Are there a plurality of cultures? And what behaviours do you believe are problematic that are linked to that culture?
Okay.
And if those behaviours are problematic, be very clear about what it is you're trying to change, and recognise that actually cultures are resistant, implicitly resistant, because they're belief systems, and those belief systems are held by people. So if you set out to challenge them head on, without actually necessarily appreciating the background and the reasons why things are as they are, and why people value the things they value, people will either resist, or more dangerously, what they will do is pay lip service to the change you want to make, whilst in point of fact doing nothing. And you do see this in organisations where people quite quickly learn about the tall poppy syndrome. There are people who will stand up and resist, and they will have their heads cut off by the mower. And sometimes
that as part of, if ultimately we're trying to change behaviours, and that's because we're trying to change the way an organisation operates, sometimes, unfortunately, it's something that we don't often like to talk about, but it may be necessary on occasion that some of the poppy heads need to get cut off in order for the organisation to survive.
But I think you have to be careful, because there are situations where if somebody adopts that simplistic mindset that says we have a culture in this global organisation,
Yep.
it's a culture that's driven here from Chicago or San Francisco or from London,
Yeah.
and we're going to change that culture globally through intent and management downwards, then people may resist for very good reasons.
Yeah.
They may resist because they're actually trying to save the organisation from the unintended consequences of their own decision.
Yeah, and I've personally experienced that.
Oh, whereabouts?
When I worked, it's nearly 20 years ago now, telecommunications company. The head office in the UK was based in Northampton, and I was in charge of launching that organisation in Germany, Austria and Switzerland. The head office, the parent company, was in Texas. I don't know if you've ever dealt with Texans before, but they have a completely different mindset and approach to the way that things work in Europe. And of course, in Europe, we're not talking about one culture. Again, we're talking about lots of different cultures. But if you think about if I were to kindly describe the Texan attitude as a little bit Wild West and let's throw a lot of mud at the wall and see how much sticks. Whereas in Britain, of course, we're a lot more reserved. And I would argue, and I can say this because I was born in Germany and I went to university out in Germany, the Germans are not necessarily more reserved than British people, but certainly more cautious than British people. And they like to be informed to an nth degree of detail before they make a decision about how to do things. And therefore, in that situation, we knew that if we tried to adopt a Texan cultural approach to launching telecommunication services in Germany, it just wasn't going to work. So yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
No, that's fine. No, I think you're right. What will happen is the native culture will go into guerrilla mode.
Yeah.
It will pay lip service to what you're asking them to do, and they will actually, where it's prudent to do so, not do what you're asking them because they want to continue to delivering a good performance for their business units and avoid aggravating customers through insensitive and inappropriate approaches.
And what we had to do eventually is that it was direct marketing, the main mode of customer acquisition, and what we actually had to do was to test market several different campaigns. Test mark a Texan campaign against a British campaign versus a German campaign. And of course, which one won?
Yeah.
Obviously, the German one performed better than the British one, which performed better than the Texan one. And it was at that point the head office in Texas said, okay, look, let's just let these guys get on with it. So you've spoken about challenges for change. We've spoken about plurality. I can't get that word out. Pluralities of culture. And we've talked about that, I suppose you could call it the subversive resistance of in different...
Yes, for good or bad reasons. It may be that it's because they're trying to insulate the customer or the market from things you're asking them to do which aren't appropriate in their locality but make a great deal of sense somewhere else. And they may actually be resisting for other reasons, but I take the view that people's perception is reality, their worldview is your worldview.
Yeah.
And if you fail to make the case for change in a sufficiently compelling way for them to actually review and change their behaviour, then that is the root of the problem.
And often that can be seen by senior management as stubbornness and resistance, but often it's there for a very, very good reason, or as you say, because you haven't made a compelling enough argument as to why the other behaviour is better.
I suppose when I was saying previously that why would you want to change culture, I think culture changes as a result of a range of communication and policy, process and procedure changes in an organisation. And if you tell a suitably compelling story, a new narrative, if you like, for the business or the organisation and the part you want employees to play in it, if you get them to reframe their view and you make it easy to do the right thing and much harder than it was previously to do the the outdated previous behaviour, in time the culture will begin to adapt.
Okay.
But I mean, in many cases, the reason why the native cultural instincts and behaviours are so ingrained is successive generations of managers have ingrained them.
Repeated the same,
yeah,
the same messages. Just coming back to that in a second, because I'd like to talk about how we go about changing culture. But before we do that, I remembered when we had the conversation a couple of weeks ago, you also mentioned about cultural change. Another one of the big challenges, because you've spoken about the plurality of change and you've spoken about the resistance against change, but one of the other things that I remember you mentioning was the fact that culture isn't static either.
No, I mean, culture is something that responds to outside influences, and we can all think of situations over even the last 15 years where business culture has changed quite radically. I used to, back in the 1990s, I used to run training courses at Bass Brewers Distributions Training Centre on the Wetmore Road in Burton-on-Trent, and there was a free bar at lunchtime in the training centre, and
what are we doing here?
Yeah, I know. And we'd break for lunch, and we'd go, who wants to be barman today? And I remember one of the delegates on the training course would get behind the bar, and they'd pull a few pints, and then we'd settle back to a nice afternoon. And of course, you know, the atmosphere.
Are you saying that's a bad thing?
I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing. I'm just saying it's changed. You know,
yeah, absolutely.
And so you know, the idea that the culture is either static or singular is mistaken. I think we can all think of situations where, you know, through things like the Me Too movement, you know, even over a comparatively short period of time, you know, businessmen were going to charity lunches or dinners staffed by young ladies wearing skimpy costumes. And a year later, after Harvey Weinstein, that was no longer even remotely acceptable. So culture can change very rapidly, and it's unpredictable how fast, and sometimes it can be a surprise to those people concerned. So I think we have to look at business culture as a subset of wider social thinking. So, you know, for someone to position themselves as an expert in culture change is a very high test, and I would probably suggest that actually it makes much more sense for people to focus on what it is they want to achieve, to understand that people behave the way they do because they have a mental picture of the world and a set of values that says doing this is the right thing, doing that is the wrong thing. If you want them to change, you have to get them to understand the reasons why it's in society's interest, it's in the interests of the employer and the interest of the customer to change, and in their own personal interests to change. If you get all those things lined up, you change the policy process and procedure in such a way it becomes easy to do the things that you want to happen and hard to do the things that you don't want to happen. And you remove the previous policies and processes and procedures which probably were put in place to drive what are now outdated behaviours, and you can move forward.
I'd like to investigate the whole idea of policy procedures and process in a second, as part of the next question.
Okay.
Which is, and I have a view on this, so I'd like to share that as well.
Sure.
Do you think that culture can be changed quickly?
I think there's a famous quote from a Chinese head of state when he was asked what did he think of the results of the French Revolution, was it a good thing or a bad thing? And he said it's probably a little early to tell. Which so
was he eating cake at the time?
So quickly or slowly is an interesting, you know, concept. But
from an organisation's perspective, if they've identified that culture change is the biggest issue that they have in terms of negative commercial performance. And when I say culture change, what I mean is obviously wanting to change the behaviours of their people, and whether you argue the cart and the horse, which way they go round, but whether behaviour and culture and behaviour, I would argue that they're inextricably linked. But if there is an imperative, commercial imperative to make changes quickly, and culture is the problem behind the underperformance of the organisation, can an organisation do anything quickly about that?
I think if you're talking about time,
Yeah.
you have to think about smart objectives.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're saying can I change culture in a particular time frame, quick
Yeah.
or slow, I'd say, well, how are you going to measure that?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's got to be measurable in some way.
Yeah.
It's got to be attainable and realistic, and it's got to be time bound.
Okay. Yeah,
So,
that makes sense.
that kind of raises the other question, which is, in any organisation, what gets measured gets done.
Okay.
So, which board?
I'd like to talk about measurement in a little bit, but sorry to
Sure.
jump in there,
Sure.
Adrian. Because measurement is actually a topic that I've got a piece of paper. We're going to talk about measurement in a little bit.
Sure.
And I want to make sure that we're going down a particular path.
Okay, that's right.
In terms of whether culture can be changed quickly, my observations from having done work is that you can't necessarily change culture quickly, but what you can do is you can kickstart cultural change. And one of the examples that I regularly come across is where organisations need to go through some kind of commercial transformation process. And you spoke about policy, process and procedure. Changing those things changes behaviour. But my experience has been that if you impose changes to policy, procedure and process on employees, often they will pay lip service to it, or they will adopt the changes, and then within a few weeks they'll go back to the way that they've always done things. The only times where I've seen policy, process, procedure really being successful is where organisations have actually said, we're actually, who understands the customer best of all? Frontline staff. Frontline staff understand the customers best of all. Nobody goes to work to do a bad job.
True,
Okay?
true.
Most people end up being unhappy in their jobs because they're going into environment. Culture isn't very, very nice, and they become demotivated. But if organisations can say, okay, we need to change, let's put the change process, the transformation process, into the hands of the employees. Okay, we will steer from the back, and they will change from the front. We'll make that happen. The fact that the frontline teams say, wow, we're actually being allowed to own the transformation process, is of in itself cultural transformation. Now, there is an argument to say, is that culture change, or is that kick-starting culture change? What do you think?
There's an old Ethel Merman song called...
What?
There's an old Ethel Merman
Who's
song.
Ethel Merman?
Ethel Merman, for those who
Was
don't
she
remember her,
mermaid?
was a very,
You're giving your age.
very
You're
energetic.
56.
I know. She's a very energetic musical artiste called Ethel Merman,
Musical.
who used to sing a song with a lyric, "It's not where you start, it's where you finish." I would take the view that actually in culture change, the reverse is true. It's not where you finish, it's where you start.
Right.
That's very important. Because you have to ask the question, well, which member of an executive board would have a KPI that covers changing the culture in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years or 4 years? And if you did, how would you measure that? So I think it's all about being very clear about what it is you want to change in terms of things you can measure, which isn't culture by and large. It's about behaviours and the beneficial or otherwise impacts of those KPIs.
Because I suppose if you go about trying to change culture, arguably the only way to measure a change in culture is to measure the changes in the way the organisation operates.
Yes, I mean, and it may be that the indexes are things like, HR events, calls to whistleblower lines. It may be measured through things which are more traditional customer experience types of metric.
Employee experience, employee
Engagement.
satisfaction.
Yeah.
customer satisfaction, etc.
So all of those things can be divvied up across a management team, and you can have someone with a laser focus on looking at any and all issues that would have a contributory positive or negative effect. I mean, the beauty of your approach is there is a limited time span to achieve change, which is driven by investors. So if you tell the city we are going to achieve X or Y, then you better be absolutely sure and confident you can deliver X and Y in that time.
So if we go back to Ethel, our friend Ethel, and the fact that the reverse of what she was singing about is true, then I guess what you're suggesting, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is that by initiating a cultural change or initiating transformational change within an organisation by giving control of that to the frontline teams is certainly a good starting position.
Well, essentially what you're doing is you're changing the interface layer with the customer first, because that is where you're going to see, in the customer experience dimension at least, probably the earliest impact. And the patience of investors isn't limitless. If they can see that you're having a beneficial impact and you pick a number of KPIs you know you can move, then investors will go, okay, you're on a journey here. I understand it might not take a year to move some of these other KPIs, but you've clearly got your priorities right. So I think it's not purely about changing policy, process and procedure. It's also about reframing what has changed for the employees concerned.
And this is the whole argument of the service profit chain, the argument that in order to bring about real improvement in customer experience, what you should really do is focus on changing employee experience and employee experience. If you focus on improving the experience of the employees and you tell the employees what is expected of them in terms of delivery of customer experience, that you don't need to worry about customer experience. Give the employees a good experience and they will give your customers a good experience.
If you've got that consistency, if you're creating a zone of freedom within them, within their sort of job remit, and you're consistent about the values you would like them to apply when given that discretion, then you'll get a positive outcome. You may also have to put in place some kind of checks and balances behind the scenes to make sure that they are continuing to do that in a way that is not seen to be intrusive or encroaching on those zones of freedom.
And this is something that American Express really prided themselves on. So when we're talking about change, we're talking about change almost at two levels. So I'm talking about it at a transformational level, whereby you set up a project team which is led by frontline staff to bring about long-term transformation to the organisation, resolving those recurring issues whereby you need to do some kind of root cause analysis to get to the roots of the problem. What you're introducing idea is the idea of empowering employees at a transactional level, whereby you're giving them the parameters where they can within certain parameters they are empowered to a certain level of discretion to make the decisions that need to be made.
And I think that we've now reached a point where the cost of a customer experience issue through the magnifying lens of social media can actually become completely if you set the threshold for management intervention too low, you're running the risk that the genie will be out of the bottle from the social media point of view before you can close the problem.
And that's something that's just changed enormously in our world within the last 20, is it probably even less than 20 years, isn't it?
I mean, from a good example, John Timpson, I'm not sure whether he's still plying the speaker circus, but I once saw John Timpson speak. He's the family member who was leading at the time the Timpson shoe repair and key cutting businesses around the UK, and they have a policy that if you have a problem with a key that you've had cut or a pair of shoes you've had repaired and the repair fails, any employee in Timpson's has discretion to refund you up to £50, which is more than nearly every bill, on the spot, or to do a repair at your choice. No need to escalate anywhere. It's just an accepted way of doing business.
And I know of organisations today who have middle management, senior middle management, who don't have that kind of budgetary sign-off.
And so you have to ask yourself, what does it say about the way the organisation views its employees?
Yeah, absolutely.
That means that is a problem. And if you've got that kind of culture, actually the idea that you might delegate that to the front line will become inherently very frightening to the apparently disempowered line managers who previously probably quite enjoyed that power, and also to the employees who never used to having it. So that in itself requires a cultural change. And I think that's the cause and effect. It's the change in policy, process and procedure drives culture change.
Yeah.
We haven't really talked about organisational change, but of course that's the other major issue is that organisational transformation might be associated with a desire to change culture, or it might not.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of, we spoke about a little bit about the role of leadership within cultural change as well. Certainly my experience has been that even if you've got flexible cultures, if you've got, I'm going to attempt to say that word again, pluralities of culture going on as well, providing a single common focus that not necessarily everybody makes 100% of their belief system, but they can adopt and adapt to their own individual belief systems, can provide everybody with a common focus by believing in something at a central point that the leaders have put in place. Hence the reason why many organisations do mission, vision, values, objectives in order to make that happen.
I think it makes absolute sense. I mean, I think if a leader can coherently explain the position the organisation is in, if he can communicate the challenges that the leadership team and the organisation at large are facing, and the reasons why he wants people to do things differently, and he or she lives those values in the way they deal with their peers, their subordinates, and also in the way they deal with any customers that they may encounter, then that's probably something that people would begin to take on board and accept. But I don't think culture change is purely a leadership challenge. It's a leadership and management challenge. And the problem is that people tend to bracket those two things together, and they even send people on leadership and management courses.
I think a lot of people have absolutely no understanding as to what the difference between leadership and culture might be.
Yeah, but so I think...
leadership and
management. Yeah, I mean, because you need, whilst the person at the top, whoever they are, can act as an exemplar, and they can select a senior leadership team who are similarly inclined and maybe suitably diverse or whatever. You've still got the history of all those layers of managers underneath, many of whom will have been brought up under the previous regime, and may well still be wedded to a lot of behaviours from the past. So it's how you actually pull the organisational levers to achieve change through the silos, through the layers of management, and that involves more than just leadership. It requires outstanding management of organisational design, if you're changing the organisation and the way it operates, structures, and also outstanding ability to execute increasingly on systems as an expression of business processes.
Systems, but the other thing that I would make mention of, it reminds me of a story I was told by a gentleman called Sean Riseborough, who's now I think he's Director of Customer Experience for Bupa. And he spoke about the fact that it's not just it's not just organisational change, it's not just the systems, but also the way in which your transformation programme is structured. And the things that really hit home to me in the story that Sean tells is, first of all, if you want to quickly get people who are resistant to an idea on board, You have to, I think we called it the big gesture or something. You have to be able to go about doing some kind of gesture that persuades the organisation that you actually seriously mean business now. And I remember when he was at Virgin, what they did there is that they used to charge customers to ring into a customer helpline. And the big challenge was, how do we persuade the organisation to give those calls away for free to customers, because we would lose something like £60 million worth of revenue if all of a sudden we lose these telephone lines. But they made the leap of faith. They made the decision to get rid of these charged customer calls, and as a result of that, the organisation said, "Wait a minute, you know what? They mean it this time. We've heard it all before, cultural change, blah blah blah. Yes, but wait a minute, they're actually doing something that we know is a negative thing for customers, and therefore they must mean it this time." The other factor that they put into place was when they built the program for cultural change, they recognised that it wasn't going to be a quick thing in order to change people's behaviours, as you quite rightly put at the heart of this. So they said that when they built their transformation program, they built it in cycles, and there was actually 5 stages to the transformation program. And the very early cycles were very much about making difficult decisions, sometimes making people redundant and trying to cut down on costs in order they could free up money to plough into the transformation program. So if you're going to really bring about transformational change and include culture change within that, you've got to recognise it's going to take a long time. There are no quick fixes. I often get sick of employee engagement programs that end up being razzle and jazz hands, and the aim is, let's try and change the culture, but they're trying to do it in a matter of weeks, and everybody knows that that's not going to bring about real behavioural change.
On the face of it, you wouldn't understand that to be the case. I think the thing is, the more deeply entrenched people's views, the more resistant they are to steps which imply error or fault, or the compelling need for them to change without a full appreciation of the reasons why they hold the views they do.
Yeah.
I think, as recent politics has probably demonstrated, that you
Who are you talking about?
well, I think in general, I think if you're trying to persuade someone's perspective, you have to actually engage with them, understand why they hold the views they do, and then if you can essentially give them new information, which means that they're happy to...
Alternative facts.
Not alternative facts, no facts, actual genuine facts that essentially allow them to say, okay, well, I held this view sincerely. Yeah. Now I understand the situation is not as I understood it. I'm prepared to change my worldview. But if you get into a situation where you're describing a culture as bad or incorrect or inappropriate, by definition you're blackening or tarring
people will automatically
the entire workforce as people have inappropriate views or inappropriate opinions. And really, if your goal is changing behaviour, why go there? Why run that risk?
Why have I suppose it's a slow and steady behavioural change.
It's where you start.
That's measurable, so you can measure the degree of change, but also that it's got to be sustainable as well, though, hasn't it?
It's going to be sustainable, but I think if you start close to the front line, if you start with KPIs which are the most important from the perspective of investors and customers, then you can have a change program which is self-funding in financial year. It's delivering a return, so you can, and then once you've actually achieved whatever you've achieved in that year, then you can have a multi-year program that takes you into other KPIs which may be less significant.
And we are going to be talking, we have spoken about this, and we are going to be talking more about the importance of quick wins. There's got to be, if you're going to invest in any kind of change program, there's got to be short-term return on investment in order to.
And I think that applies to employees too. I mean, there is in every organisation at every level, there's a high level of self-interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you come up with a new way of doing something which requires a change, which in itself is therefore difficult, because you're subconsciously competent at doing something the established way, doing something new is inherently harder, it's more cognitive load. If it starts to become very clear that actually this is driving a better result for your business unit, for your personal compensation plan, then employees are going to look much more favourably when you bring them some other proposed change in the organisation.
Because they see the personal.
They're stakeholders, absolutely. So I think if to summarise, it's not really as complicated as it seems. It's about acknowledging the strengths of the organisation as you inherited it, if you're a leader, acknowledging that the behaviours you see exhibited as a result of the many cultures that exist
are there for a reason.
Yeah. And were once probably virtuous. Not all of them will have stopped being virtuous.
Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, some of them may require change, but to persuade people to change, you need to explain in a way that's very compelling as a narrative why they need to change, and then you have to empower them through changes in structure, policy, process and procedure in such a way that safely they can embrace a new way of working. And if you do that in a way which is prioritised by proximity to the customer experience and by behaviour changes which have the biggest impact for investors and customers, then you also get a virtuous circle that's set up amongst the investors who will say, look, this management team is doing a good job, they've achieved some things this year, let's stick with them for next year and see what they can achieve if they extend that approach. And then the pressure about getting to your end point, achieving culture change, starts to become a bit irrelevant.
Becomes less of an issue,
and since you can't measure it anyway.
And how often do people start long-term programs and never get to the end of it because for them, what they're not doing is that they're not having that staged approach that Sean Riseborough put in place with objectives set at each stage so that you know whether you're achieving what you set out to achieve in the beginning.
Yeah, and maybe the time has come for an agile approach to culture change in the sense that you do minimum viable products initiatives in year, and you say, okay, let's focus on this area.
You can only do that if you treat cultural change as a behavioural change process.
And if you take it down to its lowest viable subunit level, reflecting the fact that there's a plurality of cultures. If you have KPIs that are poor, take a look at your organisation, slice and dice the data in the way that you can do it in, slice and dice that data to see, are these behaviours uniformly spread through the population of employees, or is it grouped according to previous lines of acquisition? Is it to do with fault lines that exist in the organisation, or is it indeed to do with geography or culture at a broader sense? And then targeting your interventions as sprints in those areas could well return very significant returns on investment. And as a consequence of those sprints, which in themselves, if they're based around employees helping to work out the solution to their problems with local champions, it's probably a much more practical way of going forward, as opposed to a traditional cascade model, multi-year program where we're going to run campaigns, because the likelihood is, in 5 years' time, the culture will need changing again, because the world is moving too fast.
It's not static.
It's not static, absolutely.
Okay, right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you ever.
It's a pleasure.
Formal handshake there. Thank you ever so much for your time. Hope everybody enjoyed that. The next video, I haven't even looked at the topic list yet, but we're going to be coming on to a next video in a few days' time. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, if you've got any comments, then please feel free to fire them into CX Club. And if you've got any contributions you'd like to make, please make comments. Please feel free to share the content. Thank you very much, Adrian.
It's a pleasure.
And cheerio.
Thank you.